A Man Who Survived. The White Witch of Rose Hall, Episode 1. The Arrival. They warned me not to go to Rose Hall. The clerk at the shipping office in Leadenhall Street, who had made the arrangements for my passage, a thin, gray-complexioned man by the name of Fogg. He said it quietly, as an aside, while pressing my papers into my hands. "Take care with that posting, Mr. Ashworth. Rose Hall has a reputation." I thanked him for his concern and thought nothing more of it. I was 28 years old, recently admitted to the bar, and in full possession of the young man's particular arrogance that mistakes a lack of experience for a lack of reason to be afraid. The captain of the vessel that carried me across the Atlantic said it differently. He was a weathered Cornish man with a scar beneath his left eye and the bearing of a man who had seen more of the world than he wished to. On our last evening at sea, over rum that tasted of the sea itself, he told me that he had once delivered cargo to the wharf at Montego Bay, and that the factor who had come to receive it had spoken of Rose Hall with the tone one reserves for cathedrals, hushed, reverent, and slightly frightened. "Give that estate a wide berth, son," he said. "Whatever they're paying you, it will not be enough." I thanked him also, finished my rum, and went below to sleep soundly. A solicitor in Montego Bay, a man who had been assigned to facilitate my introduction to the estate, said nothing at all. He simply looked at me, a long, measuring look, the kind a doctor gives a patient he does not think will recover, shook my hand, wished me well, and excused himself with considerable haste. I did not see him again. Every man who warned me is now dead. Every single one of them. They went in the natural way of things, or in ways I prefer not to examine too closely, but they are gone. I alone survived. And some days, on the mornings when the dream comes back, when I wake with my heart slamming against my ribs and the smell of jasmine and something darker in my nostrils, on those mornings, I am not certain that survival is quite the mercy it sounds. I am writing this now, in a room in London that smells of coal smoke and wet stone, with the rain against the window and a brandy at my elbow that I do not touch. I am writing it because someone should. Because Rose Hall is still standing on its hill above the cane fields and the sea, and its mistress, whatever she is, whatever she was, leaves marks that do not heal in the ordinary way of things. I want to tell you what I saw there, what I felt, what I almost became. I want to tell you about the night I arrived, and the woman who stood at the top of the stairs in the candlelight and looked at me not as a guest, but as something she intended to keep. I want to tell you about Annie Palmer. Rose Hall does not take men. It waits for them to give themselves. Chapter 1. The Road to Montego Bay. August, 1825, Kingston Harbor to the parish of St. James. The White Witch of Rose Hall, Episode 1. The Arrival. I shall tell you what Jamaica smelled like, because nothing else in the story will make proper sense until you understand it. The smell is the first thing, before the sight, before the sound of it. It comes to you across the water while the ship is still a quarter-mile from harbor, a warm, dense, overwhelming green smell, like something alive and enormous breathing out. There is sugar cane in it, sweet and slightly rotted at the edges. There is the iron smell of the red bauxite earth baking in the August sun. There is salt water and fish drying on wooden frames in the harborside air, and the wood smoke of cooking fires, and underneath all of it, something floral and impossibly rich. Frangipani, I would later learn, and jasmine growing wild along every fence and wall. So sweet it is almost painful. After 7 weeks at sea breathing nothing but brine and bilge in the cramped atmosphere of shared quarters below decks, the smell of Jamaica arrived like a physical blow, and I gripped the rail and stared at the green hills above Kingston Harbor with something that was not entirely rational in its intensity. The color of the place was its second assault. I had been told that the tropics were vivid. Every traveler's account says as much, but I had understood that as a comparative statement, a matter of degree. I had not understood that it was a difference of kind. The green of the hills above Kingston that morning was not the green of an English hillside in July. It was a green that had been turned up to its maximum possible expression of greenness, dense, layered, almost aggressive. The sky was a shade of blue that had no business existing above a human settlement. The sea in the harbor shaded from deepest indigo at the channel's heart to a clear, luminous turquoise near the shoreline. So transparent, you could see the pale sand 10 feet down. I stood at the rail for a long time and simply looked, while the sailors worked around me and the gulls wheeled overhead, and Jamaica received me with the magnificent indifference of a beautiful country that has no need of a particular man's admiration. Kingston docks were a roar of life. Voices in half a dozen registers of patois and English and something that was neither, a musical, quicksilver language of the port, rose from the wharves in a chorus that was, to London ears accustomed to the gray rumble of the city, nearly impossible to parse. Women balanced enormous loads on their heads with the poise of cathedral columns, moving through the crowds with a dignity that made the jostling men around them look clumsy by comparison. Children darted between barrels and bales. A man sold something from a barrow that steamed and smelled of spice. The light fell on everything at an angle and an intensity that made every surface seem to have been lacquered, so that the red of a woman's head wrap and the blue of a vendor's shirt and the dark, polished skin of the workers on the dock all registered as if seen through glass that clarifies rather than distorts. It was in this sensory cacophony that I first encountered Bertram. He was a slight man of perhaps 50, with a neat mustache and eyes that were in a permanent state of mild alarm. Not the alarm of a frightened man, but rather of a man who has learned from experience that alarm is the appropriate resting state for someone who pays attention. He held a piece of card on which was written, in careful, blotted letters, Ashworth. He was wearing a jacket that had been pressed within an inch of its life, and was already losing the argument with the August heat. He found me before I found him. He was looking at the disembarking passengers with the methodical attention of a man sorting correspondence, and when our eyes met, he came forward with an air of cautious resolution, as if approaching something that might bolt. He confirmed my name with anxious politeness, and I introduced myself in turn, relieved to find the man sent to meet me amid the overwhelm of the harbor. Bertram accepted this with the practiced manner of a servant accustomed to managing both luggage and newcomers, then asked leave to see to my trunks. He organized the retrieval of my 2 trunks with the quiet efficiency of a man who has long since learned that competence is the best way to avoid drawing notice. We loaded them onto a carriage waiting at the edge of the dock, a somewhat battered but serviceable vehicle drawn by 2 dark, bay horses who looked at the world with the resigned stoicism of animals who have seen considerable difficulty and have made their peace with it. The driver, whose name I did not learn that day, was a broad-shouldered man who acknowledged my existence with a single nod and devoted the rest of his attention to his horses. And we set off northward and westward, following the road toward Montego Bay and the parish of St. James. The drive from Kingston to Montego Bay in August of 1825 was an education in the meaning of heat, not the petulant wet heat of an English summer, which arrives apologetically and never quite believes in itself, but the absolute heat of the Jamaican interior, a heat that was total, committed, and entirely without mercy. The road wound through country that seemed to grow more lush and more improbable with every mile, as if the island was making a sustained argument for the existence of paradise. Stands of bamboo rose 40 feet beside the road, their stems thick as a man's thigh, their feathered tops moving in a wind too high to be felt at road level. Breadfruit trees spread their enormous dark leaves over the verge. Bougainvillea the color of a wound cascaded over walls and gate posts. And everywhere, always, the sugarcane, stretching away to the horizon in fields of dark green that rustled and shifted and spoke in the wind with a whispering that was almost, but never quite, intelligible. I tried to draw Bertram into conversation. He was willing enough to speak of Kingston, of the island generally, of the price of sugar and the state of the harbor and the peculiarities of the Jamaican weather. But when I turned the conversation toward our destination, toward Rose Hall, something changed in him. I asked for more than the bank's sterile figures, for the character of the estate, for whatever a man who knew the island might say that a file could not. Bertram answered with careful restraint, calling Rose Hall a fine and productive estate with a well-appointed house, and then retreated into a caution so visible that it became more revealing than candor. When I asked about Annie Palmer by name, the silence that followed was of a particular quality that I would come to recognize over the days ahead, a silence that was not the absence of response, but rather a response in itself, a very specific kind of not speaking that communicates more than speech. Bertram looked out of the carriage window at the passing cane and was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer at all. At last he said only that Mrs. Palmer was the mistress of Rose Hall and a very accomplished lady. The word accomplished was delivered in the tone of a man selecting the least dangerous item from a shelf of unstable objects. I let the matter rest. The afternoon was wearing on, and the light was turning the gold of old amber, and the cane fields were growing longer and more elaborate, and the great house, when it finally appeared all at once, as such things do. Rose Hall sat on the rise of a hill above the cane fields with the particular authority of a building that has always known it is being looked at. It was constructed of white limestone that caught the last of the afternoon sun and threw it back as a kind of cold luminosity, not the warm gold of English stone in evening light, but something harder and more considered, as if the building were lit from within by a light of its own devising. Its proportions were Georgian and formal, a broad central block of 3 stories, flanked by long verandas on each level, mahogany shutters at every window, thrown open to the sea wind. The ground swept down from it in careful terraces of dark vegetation to the cane fields that rolled away on all sides, and beyond the cane fields, just visible on the horizon, the glittering pewter of the Caribbean Sea. It was beautiful, objectively, undeniably beautiful, and something was wrong with it. I noticed this simultaneously, the beauty and the wrongness, as if they were the same quality expressed in 2 registers. I looked at Rose Hall in the amber evening light and felt the hairs on my forearms rise under my coat, and told myself firmly that I was merely fatigued from the journey, and that the solicitor's mind does not trade in presentiments. As the carriage began to move again, I glanced at the driver on his box. He had not looked at the house. He was looking straight ahead, jaw set, and his right hand moved in a quick, small gesture that I recognized after a moment's confusion as the sign of the cross. He made it once, and then gripped the reins and said nothing. Bertram, beside me, was studying the floor of the carriage with great attention. The horses went forward reluctantly, their ears back. Their gait subtly changed from the easy rhythm of the road, shorter, more cautious, as if the road uphill to Rose Hall were made of different material than the road that had brought us from Kingston. I watched the white house grow larger against the darkening sky, and thought, I am a solicitor from London. I am here to examine accounts. I shall be here 6 weeks at most. Nothing here can touch me. I was 28 years old. I was an idiot. Chapter 2. The House That Remembers. Rose Hall Great House. Evening, first night. The White Witch of Rose Hall, Episode 1. The Arrival. The entrance hall of Rose Hall was precisely what it aspired to be, the first statement of a house that understood its own importance. The floors were polished mahogany, dark as old blood, and so highly burnished that they held the candlelight in wavering, liquid pools. The ceiling was high, 14, perhaps 16 feet, and hung with a chandelier of considerable ambition whose candles had been lit in advance of my arrival, casting the hall in the warm, amber-tinged light that is always slightly theatrical in large spaces, as if the room is performing itself for an audience. The walls were paneled to shoulder height in the same dark mahogany as the floors, and above the paneling they were plastered and painted in a shade that I initially took for cream, but that resolved, as my eyes adjusted, into something a degree or two cooler, the faintest possible hint of gray, or perhaps green, so subtle as to be barely there at all, and yet productive of an atmosphere that was not quite warmth. In, Mabel was waiting. In, I say this as if she had walked to the door to receive me. She had not. She was simply there, in the hall, in the way that certain people are simply in rooms, not as if they walked in, but as if they were always there and the room arranged itself around them. She was a woman of indeterminate age. The darkness of her skin and the stillness of her face combined to make the ordinary markers of age illegible, so that I might have guessed anywhere between 40 and 60 and been uncertain of either. She was dressed in black, with a white cloth at her neck, and she held herself with the particular uprightness that is not quite a servant's stance and not quite anything else. Mabel, Mr. Ashworth, your room is prepared. I will show you. In, not, welcome to Rose Hall. Not, we are pleased to have you. Simply the statement of a fact. Room prepared, will show you, delivered in a voice that was low, measured, and entirely without effect, as if the words were items to be checked off a list. She turned and moved toward the staircase before I had fully registered the exchange, and I followed, because there was nothing else to do. In, the staircase was the centerpiece of the house, a broad, curving sweep of mahogany with a banister of wrought iron worked into the shapes of flowering vines, rising to a landing of considerable grandeur and then dividing to serve the upper floors. As I climbed it behind Mabel's soundless passage, I looked up and saw portraits lining the upper landing, the customary procession of a great house's history, rendered in oils of varying quality, with the subjects arranged in the slightly competitive way that family portraits always are, each one implying that the house was properly theirs. My room was on the second floor, at the far end of the east wing. It was generous in its dimensions and furnished with the heavy, dark-wood confidence of colonial wealth. A four-poster bed draped with white muslin netting, a writing desk and chair positioned to catch the morning light from the window, a washstand of marble-topped mahogany, a wardrobe large enough to accommodate a man of considerably more elaborate wardrobe than my own. The window looked eastward, out over a formal garden that was losing its detail to the evening dusk, and beyond the garden the beginning of the cane fields, and beyond the cane fields, darkness. I thanked Mabel, and she inclined her head and turned to leave. I noticed it then, as her hand rested briefly on the doorframe in passing. The bolt. It was on the outside of the door. A substantial bolt, well mounted, of good iron, clearly not decorative. A bolt on the outside of a guest bedroom door serves, logically, only one purpose. I stood and looked at it for a moment after Mabel had gone, and then I unpacked my trunks and told myself there was surely a reasonable explanation. Before dinner I explored. The house invited exploration in the way that large, old, confident buildings do. It was full of the particular quality of accumulated time, of rooms that had been used for many things by many people and that held some residue of all of it in their walls and their atmosphere. The ballroom on the ground floor ran the full width of the east wing, its floor gleaming and barren, its windows shuttered but admitting thin blades of evening light between the mahogany slats. The air in the ballroom smelled of old wood and something floral that had no current flower to explain it, as if the ghost of a perfume worn by someone long gone had taken up permanent residence in the room's particular climate. The great hall connected to the library, which connected to a smaller sitting room of considerable charm, and it was in the sitting room that the portraits began. They lined the walls in the manner of a family making a collective argument for its own importance. Men in the dress of different decades, women in silk and muslin, children in the stiff, unnatural postures that portrait painters of every era seem to impose on the young. I walked along them with the idle attention of a man filling time before dinner, reading the small brass plates beneath each frame. John Palmer, 1780. Catherine Palmer, 1793. Henry Palmer, 1811. The sequence of the family's history in oil and gilt frame. And then I stopped. She was painted against a dark background that gave nothing away. No garden, no house, no period furniture to place her in time. She simply was, a woman in a dress of deep emerald silk that left her shoulders bare, her dark hair loosely arranged with a carelessness that was certainly calculated. Her skin was pale, unnaturally pale for this climate, for this country, as if she repelled the sun by force of personality rather than geography. And her eyes. The painter had done something with her eyes that I could not, at first, identify, and then I understood it. He had painted them looking not at a point beside the viewer, as portrait subjects traditionally do, giving the comfortable impression of being observed from an angle, but directly out of the canvas. Directly at the viewer. Directly at me, standing in that room in the last of the evening light with a candle in my hand. The eyes in the portrait were almost black. I heard Mabel step behind me, or rather I did not hear it, which is how I knew she was there. I turned. Robert. This portrait, there is no nameplate. Whose is it? Mabel looked at the painting the way one looks at a loaded pistol left on a table in a public room, with recognition and calculation and a carefulness that was not quite fear, but was its immediate neighbor. Mabel. That is the mistress. Robert. Mrs. Palmer? She is young. This was painted recently. Mabel. You will meet her at dinner, Mr. Ashworth. She withdrew. I looked at the portrait for another long moment. The painted eyes remained attentive. I went to dress for dinner. The dinner that evening was served without the mistress of Rose Hall. Mabel informed me, with the brevity that was her chief communicative mode, that Mrs. Palmer sent her apologies and would receive me the following evening. I ate alone in the dining room, which could have seated 30 and produced, for a single diner, the particular melancholy of large spaces used for small purposes. The food was extraordinary, a cold soup of something I could not identify, then fish cooked with peppers and lime and herbs that had no English name, then a dish of meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork and tasted of spice and smoke. I ate and drank a glass of very good Madeira and listened to the house around me. And the house spoke, not in words, in the vocabulary of old buildings, the contraction of timbers cooling in the night air, the click of a shutter finding its latch, the sigh of a floorboard under some weight I could not account for, and beneath all of it, just at the edge of audibility, a sound that was not the house at all. It came from outside, from the direction of the cane fields, far enough away to be deniable, close enough to be unmistakable. A drumming. Low, rhythmic, persistent. Not a single drum, but several, speaking in a pattern that had the character of language without the translatable content of it. It rose and fell with the wind. I sat at the long table in the candlelight and listened to it, and felt, quite distinctly, that it was aware of me in some way that I could not reason away. I went to bed. I lay in the four-poster bed under the white muslin netting and listened to the drumming continue, and I thought about the bolt on the outside of my door, and I was very nearly asleep when I heard footsteps in the corridor. I lay absolutely still. The footsteps had stopped, and the stillness outside my door had a quality I cannot adequately describe in the rational language of a legal man. It was present. It was conscious. Whatever stood in the corridor outside my room was not passing through. It was there with intention, and the intention was directed, and I was its object. My heart was doing something accelerated and unpleasant in my chest. I did not call out. I did not move to the door. I lay in the dark under the white netting and listened to the silence and counted my own heartbeats. After a very long time, perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps 5, the footsteps resumed. Slow, deliberate, moving away down the corridor, growing quieter, and then gone. I lay in the dark until the first light of dawn found its way through the mahogany shutters. The drumming from the cane fields did not stop until nearly then. The silence outside my door had a quality I cannot adequately describe in the rational language of a legal man. It was present. It was conscious. The fields and the living. Morning in Jamaica arrives differently than in England. There is no gray preliminary, no slow brightening of a reluctant sky. The light comes with decision. One moment the world is dark, and then it is not, and the darkness does not linger or argue. By the time I had washed and dressed and descended to the breakfast table, the sun was already well advanced, and the world outside the great house was saturated with a light so direct that the shadows it created were not the diffuse, uncertain shadows of home, but hard-edged, architectural things, as if the light had opinions. I ate quickly and went out. I wanted to see the estate in daylight, and I wanted to begin to understand what I had been sent to audit. The bank's files told me Rose Hall was producing approximately 600 tons of sugar per annum, with a workforce of over 200 enslaved men and women, on 300 acres of cultivated cane and a further 100 of mixed provision grounds and pasture. What the files did not tell me, what no file could tell me, was what the place was like to be in. And I am a man who has always believed that you cannot understand a set of accounts until you understand what the accounts are a record of. The terraces below the great house gave onto a path that wound through the formal garden and then, past a low stone wall, opened into the working reality of the plantation, the provision grounds, the kitchen buildings, the boiling house, cold and quiet now, between harvests, the long rows of worker quarters at a respectful distance from the great house, arranged with the functional geometry of a barracks. The path between the great house and the kitchen garden ran along a low ridge from which you could see the full extent of the cane fields, and I stood there for a moment in the morning heat and tried to comprehend the scale of it, the hundreds of acres of dark cane moving in the sea wind, the glittering water on the horizon, the whole apparatus of the plantation spread below me like an argument made in land and labor. I found Celeste at the kitchen garden. She was crouched at the edge of a herb bed, selecting leaves with the focused attention of someone who knows exactly what they are looking for and intends to get it right. The garden was dense with growing things, thyme, and something broader leaf that smelled of pepper when the breeze moved through it, and rows of what I would later learn was callaloo, and the dark, waxy leaves of bay, and a dozen other plants whose names I did not know. She was perhaps 20 or 22, with a gravity in her bearing that was older than her face suggested. Not the gravity of sorrow, exactly, but of someone who has learned to carry a great deal quietly. When I came along the path, she heard me and went very still, in the way of a creature that has learned to assess before moving. She turned and looked at me, and for a moment neither of us spoke. "Robert, good morning. I do not mean to interrupt. My name is Ashworth, Robert Ashworth. I've been sent from London to look over the estate's accounts." She looked at me with eyes that were careful and dark and doing a great deal of quiet work. She did not smile. "Celeste." "Yes, sir. I know who you are." I asked about the estate. She answered, in the brief, accurate way of someone who has learned that words given freely can be used in ways the speaker did not intend, telling me where the boiling house was, the direction of the provision grounds, how many acres were currently in cane. Her answers were perfectly responsive and perfectly controlled. Then I said Annie Palmer's name. "Robert, I'm to meet Mrs. Palmer this evening. I confess I have formed rather little picture of her from what I've been told. The people in the house are careful when her name comes up." The name landed in the morning air between us, and Celeste looked over her shoulder with a swiftness that was entirely involuntary. The instinctive reflex of someone who has learned that certain words, spoken in certain places, have a way of being overheard by things that are not in the visible vicinity. She turned back to me, and the wariness in her face had deepened to something closer to urgency. "Celeste, you should be careful, sir. Rose Hall is not like other places. Things happen here that have no good explanation. Men come to this estate thinking they understand it, and they—" She stopped herself. She looked down at the herbs in her hands. "Robert, please go on. I should very much like to hear the rest of that." "Celeste, it is not safe to say more, Mr. Ashworth. I'm sorry." The conversation was over. She turned back to the herbs with a finality that I recognized as real and respected, though it cost me considerable curiosity to do so. I thanked her and continued along the path. I was perhaps 100 yards into the cane when I became aware of being observed. not in the generalized, imaginative way that a nervous man feels watched in new surroundings, but specifically, the precise, directed attention of a particular pair of eyes. I turned and found Taku. He was working, or rather, he had been working, and had stopped, and was now looking at me with the undivided attention of a man who does not pretend to be doing anything other than what he is doing. He was powerfully built in the way of a man who has worked with his body for decades and been made by it rather than diminished, broad through the shoulder, the forearms ropey with muscle, standing straight in a way that age had not bent. His hair was entirely silver, close-cut, and his face was deeply lined and beautiful in the way of a face that has been shaped by a great deal of thinking over a great deal of time. He wore a cloth of red and black wrapped at his waist, and around his neck, on a cord, was something I could not identify at the distance, a small, dark object of some kind, pressed to his chest. He looked at me for a long moment. I had the extraordinary sensation that this looking was not merely visual, that I was being assessed in some way that went considerably beyond appearance. Then he spoke. Taku. Every man who comes to Rose Hall thinks he is the first. A pause. The cane moved around us. Taku. None of them are. He returned to his work. The conversation, such as it was finished. I stood in the cane field in the full heat of the Jamaican morning and felt the weight of what I could not name. Not fear, not quite, but the intimation of something large and patient that had been here long before I arrived and would be here long after I left, if I left, which Taku's 7 words had gently but comprehensively declined to guarantee. The cane whispered around me in the sea wind, 1,000 green voices speaking in a language I could not parse. I turned and walked back toward the great house. I did not look back. I was almost sure he watched me all the way. Dinner with the witch. I arrived in the dining room at 7 o'clock precisely, as Mabel had instructed. The room was lit by a chandelier of 100 candles. I counted, in the way one does when occupying a formal room alone, and by a further 8 candles in pairs on the table itself, so that the light was generous and warm and cast everything in amber, and the mahogany walls absorbed it and gave it back softened, and the whole room had the character of a jewel box interior, enclosed, precious, slightly airless despite the open window. I poured myself a glass of wine from the decanter that had been placed at my end of the table. A very good Bordeaux, better than I had expected, and I had expected well, given the evident wealth of the place. I stood at the table and drank half of it, and looked at the chair at the opposite end, perhaps 20 feet away, on the other side of a table of startling magnificence. The silver, the crystal, the heavy linen, the arrangement of dark tropical flowers in a low silver bowl at the center, and I thought about the painted portrait in the sitting room, and about Celeste's face when I had spoken the name, and about Taku and the cane saying every man who comes to Rose Hall thinks he is the first, and I refilled my glass. And then the door opened, and she came in. I have tried, in the years since, to describe Annie Palmer accurately, and I have never fully managed it. This is not because the description is difficult, but because description implies a stable, fixed subject, and Annie Palmer was not entirely that. She was, that evening, wearing a dress of deep crimson, not red, crimson, the particular shade that exists at the darkest end of red and carries in it something of blood and something of wine and something of the interior of certain flowers, with a neckline that was entirely proper and somehow entirely distracting, and sleeves that came to her wrists and ended there in small points of dark lace. Her dark hair was loose, which I had not expected in a formal dinner setting, and it fell past her shoulders in a way that was clearly not careless, because nothing about Annie Palmer was careless, and the looseness of it was a choice, and the choice was deliberate, and the deliberateness of it landed in the room as a statement. She was pale, not the ordinary pallor of an English woman who avoids the sun, but something more absolute than that, a pallor that seemed lit from within, as if her skin had its own faint luminosity, so that in the candlelight she seemed to generate as much light as she received. Her skin was like sea foam, pale and somehow moving, though she was perfectly still. And against this pallor her eyes were extraordinary, almost black, very large, and set at a slight angle that suggested something of a cat's architecture without being anything so simple as cat-like. They found me immediately, not as a guest finds a host, or a host a guest, as a thing that is interested in another thing considers it, with attention and without embarrassment, and with a patience that implied that whatever conclusion she was drawing would be drawn on her timetable and no other. She moved like water. That is the only way I can put it. Not as if she were making effort against the resistance of the air, but as if she were moving through a medium that received and accommodated her passage without friction, so that her crossing of the room from door to chair was less like walking and more like arriving. A continuous, fluid presence that relocated itself from one point to another without the interruptions of ordinary human motion. She extended her hand. Annie. Mr. Ashworth, I am pleased you have come. I hope the journey was not too very dreadful. 7 weeks at sea is a considerable commitment for a man of your profession. Her voice was as it had been described to me in no description I had ever read. It was a voice that had been assembled from several sources, and the assembly was impeccable. There was French in it, or the ghost of French, and something else beneath that which might have been Creole, and might have been something older and less classifiable. It was low. It was deliberate. Every word was placed with the precision of a woman who is accustomed to being listened to, and has therefore never needed to raise her voice. And there was a warmth in it that was wholly convincing and produced, nevertheless, the faint and unreasonable sensation of standing close to a fire of uncertain control. Robert. Not dreadful at all, Mrs. Palmer. The Atlantic is educational in its way, and Jamaica has made the journey more than worthwhile already, I assure you. She smiled at this. The smile was a precise and considered instrument. It reached her eyes in the sense that her eyes changed when it appeared, but the change in her eyes was not the warm, involuntary opening that characterizes a genuine smile. It was something more like illumination, as if something behind the eyes had turned slightly more toward you, the way a lamp is angled to direct its beam. We sat. Mabel and 2 other women I had not seen before served the first course with the silent efficiency of a domestic operation that had been perfected over years. And the conversation began. Annie. Tell me about London. I have not been there in some years. I imagine it has not improved. Robert. That rather depends on your definition of improvement. It is louder than it was, and considerably larger, and no less gray. There is a great deal of energy in it, building, commerce, politics, argument. One can hardly walk from Lincoln's Inn to the Strand without being offered an opinion on the future of the empire. Annie. The future of the empire. A pause, in which the phrase was turned over and examined with a coolness that suggested she found it mildly amusing. And what do they say? In Lincoln's Inn on the Strand? Robert. They say it is limitless. That commerce and law will carry it to every shore. Some say the sugar trade is the engine of it all. She looked at him with the quality of attention that, I was beginning to understand, was characteristic of her, a looking that seemed to proceed in layers, so that whatever surface was presented was merely the first thing examined, not the last. Annie. The engine. She lifted her wine glass. Rose Hall has been part of that engine for over 40 years. The cane does not care about the future of the empire, Mr. Ashworth. The cane grows, and it is cut, and it is rendered, and it becomes sugar, and the sugar goes to England, and England continues. It is not a romantic machinery. Robert. No, I imagine not. And yet you have made something rather remarkable of it, by all accounts. Annie. I have made something of it that suits me, which is, perhaps, the the most one can honestly say of any enterprise. I asked her about her family. She spoke of her father briefly, a Frenchman, she said, who had interests in Haiti before the revolution made such interests untenable. Her mother she did not mention. She spoke of Haiti in the way one speaks of a country whose existence is no longer of practical consequence to you, a place that was real, once, in a former life, in a different skin. She said, I was educated by a woman in Port-au-Prince who knew a great deal more than she was supposed to know. She said it lightly, almost carelessly, but her eyes were watching me carefully as she said it, assessing my reception of it. I asked what the woman had taught her. She smiled the lamp smile. Annie. Everything that is useful, and a few things that are not useful in the ordinary sense, but that prove to be instructive in other circumstances. I turned the conversation toward the estate. She fielded every question with the ease of someone who knows the full answer, but is under no obligation to give it. Revenue figures she cited from memory, accurate, it would turn out, to the third decimal point. Production capacity she described in terms that suggested a thorough and personal understanding of the entire operation. And then I asked about James Dunmore. Robert. The bank's files note a previous overseer, a Mr. James Dunmore. I find no formal record of his departure. Could you tell me something of the circumstances? Annie Palmer set down her wine glass with the deliberateness of a woman who is deciding exactly how much of herself to show. She looked at me steadily. The interest in her eyes had not diminished. If anything, it had sharpened slightly, the way a cat's attention sharpens when something moves. Annie. Mr. Dunmore was unsatisfactory. She lifted the wine glass again. The subject was closed. The temperature of the room had dropped precisely 1 degree, or that is what it felt like, and the lamp seemed to have contracted slightly. The word unsatisfactory hung in the candlelit air between us and refused to be merely a word. I looked at her, and she looked back at me, and she was perfectly composed and perfectly still, and I thought, she has not blinked at the pace that a normal person blinks. I had noticed this earlier and filed it as imagination. Now I was less certain that it was. Robert. I see. And the bank's inquiries regarding his whereabouts. Annie. Mr. Dunmore chose to leave Rose Hall. Men sometimes do. I wish him well wherever he has gone. Another pause. The lamp smile, very precisely applied. I trust you will not feel similarly compelled to leave precipitately, Mr. Ashworth. You seem considerably more capable than your predecessor. The word capable was delivered with an inflection that was not quite what the word said, and I understood, with the part of my mind that runs parallel to the rational part and processes different information, that I was being assessed in a way that went well beyond professional competence. I took a sip of wine and said nothing, which was, I suspect, the correct response, because she nodded slightly, the nod of someone who has had a question answered by something other than words. As the final course was cleared, I noticed the ring. It was on the third finger of her right hand, not a conventional jewel in the English manner, but a substantial thing in dark gold, shaped as a serpent devouring its own tail, its form continuous and unbroken, its eyes set with 2 small stones of deep red that caught the candlelight and held it in a way that was slightly too bright, slightly too alive, for the ambient illumination to account for. I looked at it longer than I intended to. When I looked up, she was watching me notice it. Robert. An unusual piece. Annie. It is called an Ouroboros, the serpent consuming itself. It is very old, a gift from the woman in Port-au-Prince I mentioned. It means, in the tradition from which it comes, that all things are cycles, that endings and beginnings are the same event, seen from different positions. She turned her hand slightly, so the ring caught the candle fully and the red eyes blazed. I find it comforting. The evening was drawing to a close. Annie Palmer rose from the table with the same quality of fluid inevitability with which she had entered, as if gravity had made an arrangement with her that it had not made with others. She rounded the table toward the door and paused, and in pausing laid her hand over mine where it rested on the table. The touch was brief, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and it was light, the weight of a hand placed gently rather than pressed, and it was warm, considerably warmer than the ambient temperature of the room, warm in the way of something with a heat source internal to itself. And it was precise. It knew exactly where it was. Annie, I think you will find Rose Hall very instructive, Mr. Ashworth. Most men do. She withdrew. The door closed behind her with a sound that was barely a sound at all. I sat in the candlelight for a long time and looked at the place on the back of my hand where her fingers had rested. There was a warmth there that persisted well beyond what the touch could physically account for. Not unpleasant, not burning, but specific, as if the warmth had a shape, as if it had been left there on purpose. I could not have told you. Sitting in that dining room with the last of the Bordeaux going warm in my glass and the moth returned to circle the nearest candle, I could not have told you whether I was attracted to Annie Palmer or frightened of her. I suspect this uncertainty was itself a kind of answer. What the dark carries. From the Journal of Robert Ashworth, Rose Hall Plantation, August 14th, 1825. Midnight, or thereabouts. I write by the light of the bedside candle, which throws long shadows up the white muslin of the bed curtains and makes the room larger than it is by day. I have been awake since I came upstairs. I do not think I will sleep. The dinner with Mrs. Palmer has occupied my thoughts in a way I find simultaneously understandable and troubling. She is, in the purely objective sense of the word, remarkable, a woman of obvious intelligence, considerable poise, and a quality of self-possession that borders on the absolute. That she is also strikingly beautiful is not a point I wish to dwell on, since it is not relevant to the work I am here to do. I note it in the interest of completeness and shall not return to it. I shall return to it. The warmth on the back of my hand has not diminished. It has been 3 hours. This is not normal. I am a rational man, and I note it as a fact, and I do not know what to do with it as a fact. What I know of Annie Palmer. She is approximately 30 years of age. She is of French and, I suspect, other heritage. She has been at Rose Hall for 7 years. She has been married 3 times. She is sole proprietor of the estate following the deaths of her husbands. The word deaths sits on that sentence with a specific gravity. I shall examine the estate records carefully. What I suspect of Annie Palmer, I shall not write that down. I closed the journal and went to the window. The night outside was immense. The Jamaican dark is not the dark of an English country house, where the lights of a village or a road are always somewhere in the distance making company. It is a dark of real depth and dimension, a dark that has content and texture, through which the shapes of trees and cane and the far silver glitter of the sea are less visible objects than felt presences. The moon was 3/4 full and high, and by its light the cane fields below the house were visible as a wide, dark, moving surface, like a sea of a different kind, slow and breathing and enormously alive. The drumming had resumed. It had been at the very edge of perception all evening, but now, in the deep quiet of midnight, it was more present, more insistent, more rhythmic, more clearly articulated. Not one drum but several, as I had noted the night before, and they were speaking in a call and response pattern that had, to my ears, the character of a ceremony, structured, purposeful, old. Not the random percussions of celebration, but the organized, intentional language of ritual. At the far edge of the cane fields, perhaps 300 yards from the great house, I could see the light of torches, not the fixed, static light of lanterns hung on posts, but the moving, living light of fire held and carried by people in motion. I could make out, in the moonlight and the torch glow, figures moving in a wide circle, slow, deliberate, unhurried, with the contained energy of people engaged in something that demands exactly the effort they are giving it, and no more. There were perhaps 20 of them, perhaps more. In the torchlight and the dark, they were shapes rather than faces. But one of them I recognized. At the head of the circle, or what appeared to be its head, the point from which the others oriented themselves, stood a tall, silver-haired figure in cloth of red and black, and even at 300 yards in the partial dark, the bearing of that figure was unmistakable. Taku. He stood at the center of something that was being conducted in his name, or by his authority, and the drums responded to his presence in the way that music responds to a conductor, not mechanically, but in relationship, the pattern shifting and deepening as he moved, as he raised his hands, as he turned. I watched for a long time. I do not know how long. Time at Rose Hall had a way of behaving differently than it did in London, in the way that all measurements behave differently when the instrument is imprecise or the conditions unusual, and at Rose Hall, at midnight, watching figures move by torchlight in the distant cane fields, my ability to measure time was unreliable. And then the candle behind me guttered. I turned. The room was empty. There was no draft. The window was open, yes, but the air outside was still, and a draft sufficient to disturb a candle would have been felt on my face as I stood at the window. There was no draft. The candle had guttered without cause, and it had settled again, and the room was empty. I looked at the mirror on the washstand. It was an oval glass in a mahogany frame, positioned to reflect the window, and, from my current angle of approach, my own face returning from the dark. I moved toward it, and for a moment, it was brief. It was at the extreme edge of what the eye is prepared to confirm. It was the kind of thing that a rational man files immediately under the heading of trick of the light or the result of an overwrought imagination. For just that moment, the reflection in the glass was not mine alone. There was a shape behind my reflection. Or rather, there was a shape where my reflection's background was, in the place where the reflected room should have been. A woman's shape, or the suggestion of one, a pale, vertical presence at the edge of the reflected space, not moving, not defined, more the impression of a watching than the substance of a watcher. Dark eyes, or the impression of dark eyes. Looking. I blinked. When I looked again, it was only my own reflection, pale and startled in the oval glass. A young man in a white nightshirt with wide eyes, and the look of someone who has just understood something that his education gave him no tools for. I blew out the candle. I got into the bed. I lay under the white muslin netting and listened to the drumming with my eyes open in the dark, and I thought about Annie Palmer's eyes in the portrait finding me across the sitting room, and Annie Palmer's hand on mine at the dinner table, warm as something lit from within, and I thought about the footsteps in the corridor the night before, and the bolt on the outside of my door, and Celeste's voice saying Rose Hall is not like other places. In silence between the last drum and the first bird, the darkness in my room seemed to breathe, seemed awake, seemed aware. I closed my eyes, and I did not sleep, and the morning came regardless. You have reached the end of The White Witch of Rose Hall. Episode 1. The Arrival. Rose Hall does not let men go easily. Some say she never lets them go at all. Episode 2. The Mistress, coming next.